His parents left him because of his face. Now he's a global icon they begged to meet. Imagine being abandoned the moment you took your first breath. Not because you cried too loud or weren't wanted, but because your face didn't look like theirs. That's the reality for a boy whose own parents couldn't bear to hold him. They left him at the hospital, without a name, without a goodbye. But what if I told you, 25 years later they were standing in a crowd, tears in their eyes, begging for his forgiveness, and he didn't even recognize them? This isn't fiction. This is a story of pain, resilience, and a jaw-dropping twist you won't see coming. Welcome to Cracks of Light, where we share real stories that break your heart just to put it back together stronger. Before we dive deeper, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Cracks of Light so we can keep bringing powerful, true stories to life. It was just before dawn when they found the baby. Wrapped in a worn, thin cloth, he lay silent on the edge of the village path, as if even his cries had been swallowed by the shame of being unwanted. The night, rain hadn't touched him, which was strange in itself. No one knew how long he'd been there, but the old iron gate near the banyan tree had swung open during the night, a sign, they whispered. But no one dared to pick him up, because of his face. The baby's skin was soft and fair, but across his left cheek ran a thick, purplish mark like a scar that had never healed. One eye seemed to glow faintly amber in the light. It wasn't the mark itself that frightened people. It was how out of place it looked, almost like something cursed. The village wasn't unkind. They raised orphans, helped the poor, buried the nameless. But this child, no one wanted to touch him. The priest muttered it was a punishment for sins not yet paid. A woman selling fruit crossed herself 3 times and said she saw a shadow pass when she looked in the child's eyes. By noon, people began avoiding that road altogether. Some said he'd disappear on his own, or nature would take back what should not have been left. But then, the old blind woman came. She had lived on the hill for years, hardly speaking to anyone but the children who brought her herbs and water. No one knew her real name anymore, just old Mima. She walked with a crooked stick and pale eyes that never blinked. That morning, she walked straight to the child, knelt beside him, and without a word, picked him up. His name is Kian, she said to no one in particular, and he's staying with me. People didn't argue with old Mima. Some said she was half mad. Others believed she spoke to spirits in the trees. Either way, the village let her have the boy. Some hoped she'd lose interest. Others thought he wouldn't survive the winter, but Kian didn't die, he grew. Slowly at first, thin and quiet, eyes always watching, never too far from the shadows. He didn't laugh like other kids, didn't join their games. When they teased him, called him names, pointed at the mark on his face, he didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just stood there, expressionless, as if the words couldn't touch him. Mima would talk to him for hours, though no one ever heard him respond. She said he understood. She said his silence wasn't a weakness. It was a way of listening deeper than words. Some nights, lights flickered strangely from the old hut on the hill. Once, a girl claimed she saw the mark on Kian's face glow in the dark. Another boy swore he saw a shadow of something large crouched near the house, like a beast. People started avoiding Mima's place entirely. But they couldn't ignore Kian Duppy by the time he was 10. He'd grown into a thin, sharp-eyed boy with strange strength for his size. He could lift things older boys struggled with, and animals followed him, dogs, birds, even a wounded fox once limped behind him for days. Still, no one got close. School was a disaster. Teachers refused to punish the other children when they mocked him, afraid of upsetting their own kids. When he tried to answer questions, some laughed before he opened his mouth. The principal finally asked Mima to stop sending him. She did. Without a word at home, Kian read the same books over and over. Mima's hands couldn't turn pages, but her mind held stories, dozens of them. Legends of people with gifts, of monsters with human hearts, of battles no one remembered but the wind. She told them as if they were memory, not fiction. Kian remembered every word point one day. He asked her, "Is there something wrong with me?" It was the first time he spoke in years. Mima smiled, touched the side of his face where the mark ran down like spilled ink. "There's something different. That's not the same thing." Kian nodded, but he didn't ask again. What he did instead was start going to the forest. Not to play, not to explore, to walk. Every day, deeper than the last. He never got lost. Birds never scattered when he passed. Sometimes he'd sit near a stream for hours. Once, a wolf came close enough to drink beside him. The next day, the wolf was gone, but a claw mark had been left near their spot, deep and deliberate, as if scratched in stone. People heard rumors, of course. They said the boy was not really a boy. They said Mima wasn't blind, only hiding something. Some whispered he was a creature raised to bring misfortune. Others said he'd been born to punish someone in the village, but no one knew who Kian heard them. But he stayed silent, because deep down, even at that young age, he'd already begun to understand something no one else did. That his birth was not a mistake. That the scar was not shameful. That the pain of being abandoned would not define him. But for now, he stayed quiet and watched, because the world wasn't ready yet. Kian never quite fit in. At school, the other kids avoided him like his presence was contagious. They called him names behind his back, and sometimes even to his face, mutant, freak, cursed. It wasn't just the children. Teachers pretended not to see. When he raised his hand, they skipped past him. When others teased or shoved him, they acted like he'd provoked it. Kian learned quickly that justice was something reserved for those who looked normal. During recess, he'd sit alone on the steps behind the school. Sometimes he pretended to read, but mostly he stared at the cracks in the concrete. Every once in a while, someone would throw something at him. Crumbled paper, a rock, even spit. He never flinched. He never told. The few times he tried to defend himself, they'd accuse him of starting it. The principal once told him he was too intense and made others uncomfortable. That was the day Kian realized the world didn't hate him because of what he did. It hated him because of what he was. At home, the mirror became his enemy. Every time he looked into it, he saw the reminder. That birthmark. That eye. The face that made people look twice, never kindly. He once covered all the mirrors in the house with cloth. When Mima asked why, he just said he didn't like reflections. She didn't push. She rarely did. But that night, as they sat near the fireplace, she said quietly, "You were never meant to blend in. Some lights don't belong in the crowd. They shine better alone." He didn't respond, but something about the way she said it stayed with him. Mima treated him like he wasn't broken, like he wasn't something to be fixed. She'd tell him stories, ones that didn't always have heroes or endings, but always had truth. One evening, she told a tale about a boy with no voice who spoke through wind and fire. Kian asked her if that boy ever got to be heard. She said, only when the world was quiet enough to listen. One rainy week when school was canceled, Mima gave Kian a notebook. She said, "Write me a story. Any story." At first, he hesitated. What did he possibly say that mattered? But he wrote anyway. A short tale about a tree that refused to fall even when the forest burned. When he read it aloud to her, she cried. That was the first time Kian saw what his words could do. The room had gone silent, like even the air paused to listen. Her face didn't look sad. It looked full, like the story had reached something deep. After that, he wrote more. Stories, poems, thoughts. Sometimes dark, sometimes strange, but always real. He never showed anyone but her. He didn't need applause. The act of speaking, of being heard by even one person, was enough. One day at school, during a presentation, a substitute teacher asked for volunteers to read a passage aloud. No one raised their hand. Kian did. The class laughed. The teacher allowed it anyway. Kian stood up, voice low at first, but steady. As he read, the room shifted. People stopped whispering. Some sat straighter. Even the usual bullies stared. Not in disgust this time, but like something unfamiliar had cracked open. When he finished, the room was dead quiet. The substitute nodded and said, "That was powerful." He didn't care about the compliment. He cared that, for once, they had listened. From that point on, whenever there were presentations, Kian volunteered. Not always to read, sometimes to speak, sometimes to tell a story from memory. It was the only time the room didn't feel hostile. When he spoke, the judgment paused. Not gone, but suspended. At home, Mima encouraged him. "There's more to your voice than sound," she told him. "When you speak, you pull people in. They feel something. That's rare." But even as his voice grew stronger, his isolation didn't fade. Outside the classroom, nothing changed. The whispers, the looks, the quiet cruelty, they remained. He walked through school halls like a ghost with a pulse. Still, Kian began to realize something. His pain, the alienation, the shame, it all had weight. And when he shaped that weight into words, people carried it with him. For a moment, they shared the burden. He was 13 when a visiting counselor came to the school and asked students to talk about something that mattered to them. Most stayed silent. Kian stood and told a story, not about himself, but about a bird with a broken wing who taught others how to fly without ever leaving the ground. When he finished, the counselor stared at him for a long time. Then she said, "Have you ever thought about speaking publicly? You have something important in you." Kian didn't answer. But on the inside, a new thought took root. Maybe his face, his voice, his entire existence. Maybe none of it was a mistake. Maybe being an outsider was exactly what gave him something to say. When the NGO arrived in the village, no one paid much attention at first. They were just more outsiders, asking questions, taking notes. But one of them, a woman named Alara, stayed longer than most. She wasn't interested in the people who wanted to talk. She watched instead. Watched how some kids huddled together, how others were ignored. That's how she noticed Kian, quiet, sitting alone at the edge of the community center, sketching something on a folded piece of paper. She didn't interrupt. The next day, she came back, this time with a small recorder and a strange request. "Tell me a story, any story you want." He stared at her, unsure if she was mocking him. But she waited patiently. So he told one. A short tale about a boy made of smoke who couldn't be caught, only felt. When he finished, Alara didn't laugh. She said, "You have something rare. Let me help." That's how it started. A few weeks later, she returned with papers, signatures, and something Kian had never imagined possible. A full scholarship to a private program in the city. It wasn't just school. It was housing, food, mentorship, everything. Mima, though frail by then, insisted he go. "Your story doesn't belong in this village anymore," she said. Kian cried for the first time in years the night he packed his things. The city was a different world. Bigger, louder, and colder. At first, Kian thought maybe things would be different here. That people in the city might be more open, more accepting. He was wrong. The stares didn't go away. If anything, they grew sharper. Here, appearance was currency, and Kian was bankrupt. In his new school, the students came from polished families. They had perfect teeth, clean shoes, names people respected. Kian was just the boy with a strange face and secondhand clothes. He tried to stay invisible, ate lunch in stairwells, avoided eye contact. But in the classroom, his voice still carried weight. When he spoke, really spoke, people listened. Some resented him for it. One boy, Darren, mocked him openly. "Hey, storyteller," he'd sneer, "make up a tale about how you got that face." Kian didn't respond. He learned not to, but the sting didn't fade. He pushed himself harder, read more, wrote more, stayed up nights crafting words that bled truth. If he couldn't belong, he'd outperform. And yet, no matter how much he achieved, he still walked hallways like a ghost. One evening, while walking home from a late tutoring session, it happened. The streets were wet, the traffic fast. Kian was crossing at a narrow bend when a car came too quickly around the corner. He turned, saw the headlights, and froze. There wasn't time to move. The impact threw him sideways, slamming him against the curb. Then black. He woke up days later in a sterile room, everything white and humming. His ribs ached. His leg was in traction. Breathing hurt. Alara was there when he opened his eyes. "You're lucky," she said, voice thin. "You almost didn't make it." Kian didn't speak. The pain was too thick. But something shifted. That brush with death peeled back something raw. During recovery, he was assigned a counselor, Dr. Isaac Rell. He wasn't like the others. He didn't ask about the accident. Not right away. Instead, he handed Kian a notebook and said, "Write whatever comes out." Kian stared at the blank page for hours before scribbling one sentence. "They always look, but never see." Dr. Rell read it and nodded like he understood something deeper than the words. The sessions weren't normal therapy. Dr. Rell challenged him, questioned his silence, pushed him to articulate the rage, the shame, the exhaustion of living inside a face the world didn't want. You think your pain isolates you, he said once. But what if it's your greatest bridge? Kian didn't answer, but he started writing more. Not just fiction, real thoughts. Ugly truths. Weeks turned to months. The body healed. But more importantly, the voice sharpened. Dr. Rel introduced Kian to a public speaking initiative for youth survivors. Kids with stories that hurt to tell. Kian hesitated. I don't want pity, he said. Dr. Rel replied, then give them power. The first event was small, maybe 30 people. Kian stood behind the mic, fingers cold, heart hammering. But when he opened his mouth, everything fell quiet. He didn't speak of scars. He spoke of silence, of how the world builds walls around people who don't fit, of how loneliness carves deeper than wounds. And when he finished, no one clapped right away. They just sat, absorbing. Then, one by one, they rose to their feet. That night, he sat alone in his room and stared at the mirror. The same reflection looked back, but this time he didn't flinch. The face hadn't changed, but the story behind it had. The second time Kian stood on stage, it wasn't in a therapy circle. It was a high school auditorium packed with 500 students. He wasn't invited as a victim, but as a speaker. The organizer had seen a clip of his first talk online and reached out. Kian almost said no, but something in him, it wasn't confidence yet, more like responsibility, pushed him forward. He rehearsed in front of a mirror. He cut lines that sounded like begging. He kept only what felt honest. That day, when he stepped up, kids whispered, stared, nudged each other. He didn't let it shake him. He looked straight at them and began. I was left at birth because of my face. But what hurt more was growing up believing it was my fault. The room went silent, and it stayed that way for 20 full minutes. When he finished, no one moved. Then a girl in the third row stood up and clapped slowly. Others followed. By the end, kids were crying. A student recorded the whole thing and posted it online. No edits, no captions, just Kian, raw and unfiltered. It went viral. 1 million views in 4 days. Then 5 million. Comments poured in, people from every walk of life saying his words hit something they hadn't touched in years. Parents wrote that they finally understood their kids better. Survivors of bullying said they felt seen. Kids who'd never spoken in class began raising their hands. Kian wasn't just a face anymore. He was a voice. He started receiving invitations from schools, youth centers, and conferences. It wasn't always easy. Some places still stared. Some parents protested. Why bring someone like him to talk to our children? But the students always responded. And that was enough. He didn't aim to inspire. He aimed to tell the truth. But the truth had power. And people listened. TV producers started calling. News anchors asked for interviews. A major network aired a segment titled, The Boy They Threw Away, Now the Voice of a Generation. Kian hated the title, but it didn't matter. What mattered was what followed. Donations poured into an online fundraiser launched by a group of teachers moved by his story. He used it to start something he wished had existed for him, a foundation for kids born with facial or physical differences. He called it the light within, not because he wanted to sound poetic, but because he knew firsthand that most pain isn't visible, and neither is most strength. The foundation started small, a hotline, a scholarship fund, monthly peer circles. But it grew fast. Volunteers came from all over. Therapists offered their time. Survivors offered their stories. It wasn't charity. It was connection. Kian kept traveling. He never used scripts. He never memorized lines. Every talk was different, depending on what the room needed. One day, he spoke to students in a detention center, boys with hardened faces who didn't trust anyone. He started with silence. Let them get uncomfortable. Then he said, I've been invisible longer than some of you have been alive. But I'm still here. By the end, 3 boys asked for notebooks. One later sent a letter saying he was trying to talk to his mother again. Kian wasn't a celebrity. He didn't want to be, but people treated him like one. Fans came up to him in cafes. Kids ran across the street to hug him. Adults cried in his presence. He stayed humble, uncomfortable even, but he understood. They weren't reacting to him. They were reacting to what he represented, survival without bitterness. He once spoke at a medical university. Afterward, a future surgeon came up teary-eyed and said, I used to think of facial deformity as a defect. You changed that. I want to be the kind of doctor that helps kids like you live, not hide." Kian nodded, no words needed. He kept his promise to Mima, too. Her photo stayed in his bag, always. At every talk, he ended with her words, "You are not broken. You are built different for a reason." The room always went still. Eventually, his story reached international platforms. A documentary team followed him for 6 months. They filmed him at hospitals, schools, protests. They asked him what he wanted people to remember most. He said, "That being different isn't a flaw. It's a challenge and sometimes a gift." When the film released, it won awards. But more importantly, it made change. Lawmakers started talking about inclusive education. A tech company funded adaptive learning tools for children with visible conditions. And the light within opened its first international chapter. Years after his first speech, Kian stood in front of 20,000 people in an open-air stadium. A sea of lights. He wasn't nervous. Not anymore. He told them about being abandoned. Yes, but also about being found. About choosing to speak when silence was safer. About pain that doesn't vanish but evolves. And when he finished, the lights didn't go out. They stayed lit. After the event, a woman approached. She was older, shaky. Behind her stood a man with graying hair. She whispered, "We think we're your parents." Kian looked at them. They looked nervous, hopeful. He didn't say anything at first. Then he stepped closer. "You left me because of my face," he said evenly. "But that face, this face, is now seen by millions." They started to cry. He didn't. "Not then. I don't hate you," he said quietly. "But I've already been found." Then he walked away. The cameras didn't follow. That moment wasn't for the world. It was for him, and it was done. The room was full of light. Rows of people clapped as Kian stepped down from the stage, the applause still echoing in his ears. He just finished speaking at a major human rights conference, his largest audience yet. Behind him, a screen still displayed the closing line of his speech. "You can abandon someone at birth, but you can't bury their fire." He moved through the crowd, nodding politely at people who reached out, thanking him, telling him he'd changed something inside them. Then, out of nowhere, a woman's voice cracked the noise. "Kian." He turned. A woman and a man stood just a few feet away, blocking his path. The woman's hands trembled. Her eyes searched his face like she was looking for a ghost she had lost and feared to find. The man didn't speak, just looked at him. Gray hair, thin shoulders, both familiar and foreign. The woman stepped forward. "It's us," she said. We're parents." Kian didn't move. He didn't blink. For a full second, everything around him disappeared. No crowd, no noise, just a burning pressure in his chest. He looked at their faces, and it was like watching two strangers where a story he'd lived without them. They were older than he expected, more fragile. They weren't monsters. They were just people, and somehow, that made it worse. The man finally spoke, voice barely above a whisper. "We saw the video. We've been following your work. We never imagined," he stopped. The woman reached in her bag and pulled out an old cloth, wrapped around something. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a baby blanket, faded, but Kian recognized the thread patterns. "You were wrapped in this," she said. "We kept it." Kian's throat tightened, but he didn't let it show. "Why?" he asked. The woman's face broke. "We were told," she said, eyes now full of tears, "by a spiritual healer. He said you were born under a cursed star, that if we kept you, tragedy would fall on us all. We were scared. We didn't know better. We were poor. We believed him." Her voice cracked. "I wanted to keep you. I swear I did. But your father—" "I left you there," the man interrupted. "At the village gate. I didn't even look back. I was a coward. I've regretted it every day." Kian wanted to scream, not out of hatred, but because none of this undid anything. It didn't erase the years of isolation, the faces that stared in disgust, the nights he lay awake wondering why he wasn't enough. These two people had shaped the first chapter of his life by vanishing from it, and now they wanted in. "Do you want forgiveness?" he asked flatly. The woman nodded through tears. "We just want to know you, even if it's too late." Something twisted inside him. He didn't know if it was rage, pity, or something darker. He wanted to run. He also wanted to collapse into their arms and ask every question he never got to ask. But he couldn't do either. Not yet. Instead, he walked away. Not far, just to the edge of the hallway. He leaned against the wall and breathed. Deep, controlled. Memories came like fire. Mima's hands braiding his hair. The day he first learned what deformed meant, the moment he realized he wasn't wanted. He'd spent his whole life building something out of ashes. And now, the ones who lit the fire had shown up asking to be part of the warmth. They waited. 10 minutes. Maybe more. When he returned, he didn't sit. He stood in front of them, arms crossed, eyes locked. I built myself without you, he said. Every inch. Every scar. You don't get to walk back in and act like we're family. The man nodded slowly, guilt written in every wrinkle. The woman wiped her face. We're not asking to be family. We're just asking for a chance. Even if it's small. He studied them. This wasn't like the movies. There was no sweeping music, no emotional hug, no perfect closure. Just three people standing in a hallway full of mistakes. He didn't know what the right answer was. He only knew what Mima would say. You don't have to open your door, but you do have to look through the window, just to be sure it's really them. So he gave them a window. He told them about the years they missed, about the village, the bullying, the night he almost jumped off the roof, and the old blind woman who raised him better than any blood ever could. He told them about the first speech, the foundation, the people he met who believed in him before he believed in himself. They cried the whole time. Not for show. It wasn't performative. It was broken, quiet weeping, the kind that belongs to people who realize too late what they've lost. When he was done, he said, "That's who I am. Not because of you, but in spite of you." He didn't hug them. He didn't say, "I forgive you." But he didn't walk away this time. They stood in silence for a while. And then he said, "If you want to know me, you'll have to start like everyone else. From zero. No shortcuts. No calling me son right away." The woman nodded. "Okay, we'll wait. As long as it takes." They exchanged numbers. He didn't promise anything. But later that night, he saved their contact as maybe. That was enough for now. Not because they deserved it, but because Kian deserved to choose. For once, he was the one deciding who stayed and who didn't. And that power, more than anything, was the proof he had healed further than he'd ever imagined. A month later, Kian sat alone in his apartment, staring at a pile of unopened letters on the table. Most were from children. Some were drawings. Others were stories. All of them shared a theme. You made me believe I could be something. Some were from kids with facial differences. Others were just kids who felt invisible. He read every one, and with each line, he felt something shift inside him. Not pride, not ego, but responsibility. He had become a voice others leaned on, and with that came weight. He'd spent his whole life proving he mattered. Now he had to make sure others didn't have to do the same alone. He went back to work, harder than before. He partnered with medical organizations to provide facial surgeries for kids in underdeveloped regions. He launched global campaigns under his foundation, now renamed Cracks of Light International. His message was simple. Your difference is your doorway. Schools began inviting him to speak. Parents reached out. Universities sent awards. But none of that changed how he woke up each morning. The face in the mirror was still his. The scarred ridge down his left cheek. The misaligned jaw. He didn't want to change it anymore. But he would never forget how hard it had been to accept. On his 30th birthday, Kian walked onto a TEDx stage. The room was dark except for one spotlight. No notes. No teleprompter. Just him. "I was born with a face that made people look away," he began. "And for years,